Alright, when we're thinking about reflective practice, we're drawing upon a body of published research and theory that extends back at least as far as these two characters here who were working in the mid-70s to the early 80s, and beyond that into the 1930s with the work of John Dewey, who himself was carrying forward a tradition that was present in Western philosophy from the earliest times, work by Plato and even some of the things that we attribute to Socrates. The notion of thinking about thinking is what we're going to get into here. So Argyris and Sean worked together, and in the 70s they did their research, and it was mostly action research, we would call it probably today. And they developed ideas and models, and then Sean published them in The Reflective Practitioner, which is a text that's still widely held as a very valuable book, full of important and interesting insights. And this is, I think, this summarizes what they're saying. So reflection is the metacognitive process of exploring our experiences in order to deepen and extend our knowledge and understanding of practice. Now, for clarity, metacognition, that just means thinking about thinking. That's the thing I said before at the top of it. So what we're supposed to be doing is thinking about what we did and thinking about the thinking that guided what we did, so as that we can understand our practice better and maybe extend, change, or develop it in some way. So for Sean, you could say that reflection is thinking about the thinking that got you doing what you did. Clearly his ideas have been very influential, and some of his most important work is this distinction in these key concepts between reflection in action and reflection on action. When we're thinking about reflection in action, the illustration is very often this kind of idea of a skilled craftsperson, like the cooper here who's making a barrel. When we're engaged in skilled practice, the materials that we work with or the situation that we find ourselves in, there are small variations and there are things that are hard to anticipate in advance, and our skill and experience allow us to work with the small variations and difficulties, work around them, and still realize the outcome that we're after. So the skilled practitioner applies their skills to the task, monitor the practice, detect errors, make corrections, and improve the outcome. Sean says that this reflection in action like this is very present tense. It takes place, his famous phrase was on the hoof. It contrasts it with the notion of reflection on action, which he describes as being retrospective or backward looking. So here, this is the taking stock moment. Sometimes people get the kind of idea that reflection or reflective practice is all about looking back at what you did. And to some extent that's true, but the thing that has to come out of it is not just what you did, but the thinking and the values and the ideas that guided the behaviour. Because whilst you're in the midst of doing and correcting and making the small changes and being skillful, it's very hard to be conscious of the guiding values that underpin the behaviour. And that's what Sean says that we have to get to from the reflection on action. So we identify the things that cause us problems, just as the reflection in practice. And then we plan to avoid them by thinking about how we could not be in that situation in the future, or how we could minimize the impact of our assumptions, or be more flexible about some of the things that we think of as being valuable or essential. So here's Chris Argyris, who's got an idea to illustrate this with for us. So back to the skillful practitioner, a carpenter sawing up planks of wood, monitoring his accuracy as he works. When the plank begins to slip underneath his saw, he changes his position to hold it still with his knee. And that's what he means by reflection in action. So you can see that kind of thing on most work sites here. So the guy starts off over here, he's sawing the piece of wood, and of course, because he's not got it clamped or held in place, the cutting becomes inaccurate. He then modifies his behaviour and starts to hold it still in some way. Of course, the net result is that somebody will point out the hole in your jeans, and you'll realise, the reason why I've got the hole in the jeans there is because I'm always using my knee to pin down the job of work. And maybe that tells us something about what our values are. Maybe we shouldn't be in such a great hurry. Perhaps we'd be better or more accurate, or wouldn't wear our jeans out quite so quickly, if we prepared a little in advance and made sure we had clamps and saw benches to hand when we needed to do that kind of a job. So for Sean and Argyris, effective learning and development transforms the tacit knowledge that the clamp has to be in action, the work has to be pinned down, into something that we can be conscious of by making it explicit. As we reflect upon our actions, we come to realise what was valuable, what was important, what we'd assumed, and we can then plan for and handle that more effectively in the future. So there's the reactive reflecting in action thing, clamping the work with the knee. As we reflect on the practice, we realise maybe what we needed was a saw bench and clamp. Sean illustrates this process further when he talks about learning in loops. So he has this notion of learning in a single loop to begin with. So here's a plan that we've got. We're planning some kind of house here, a clapboard wooden structure. Having got our plan, we do the things that we plan and we monitor activities because we're skillful practitioners. And of course, as we become conscious of or identify problems with our planned and delivered activities, we make small changes, we revise our plans to improve things. Hopefully it doesn't go quite as disastrously wrong as this. And Sean calls that, as I said before, single loop learning. So where we have more than one single loop learning, later on we can think about other houses that we built in the same way and other corrections that we made, and yet other houses that we built and the corrections that we made. And here's the architect, that's Chris Wren, and he's there thinking to himself, well, maybe I shouldn't be building these kinds of houses at all, single skin wooden houses, that they're not perhaps that hard wearing, especially if you think about them being in exposed locations. And it's only when he takes the step back and looks at what he did and how he corrected for the problems that he encountered that he begins to realise he's always building the same kind of house in the same kind of place, and it's the contradiction between those two things that means that he's able to then change the way he thinks and behaves. And Sean calls this double loop learning. Now this notion of loops and double loops and things, this has become really central to the rest of the field. So other theorists have come along since Sean, inspired by his notion of reflecting in and upon action, and suggested alternatives. So in 1984, just a wee bit after Sean, we've got, this is David Kolb here, isn't it? And his idea of, analyse have the experience, what happened, concrete experience, analyse it in some way, break it down into its parts, think about the relationship between the different bits. Then make some generalizations on the basis of your analysis, get some abstract conceptualization on the go, plan for the future active experimentation phase, back into some kind of concrete experience, back into analysis, and it never ends. This loop has to go on and on and on. And this is rather like the double loop that we had over here. This is Atkins and Murphy, the famous study by the nurses. Would put somebody into a new situation, a new experience. They interrogate or report upon their awareness of feelings and thoughts. What was that like for you? They describe the situation, the concrete particulars of the case. Analyse those again, that's like Kolb and the analysis here. Break it apart, think about the relationship between the parts. Makes us aware of assumptions that we've made. Makes us think about alternatives that we might have otherwise ignored. Then we evaluate all the alternatives and all of the assumptions, work out whether or not they're actually that important, identify what we've learned, and feed that back into the new experience so that we're able to handle the new experience more effectively. Here's the rather simpler one. I quite like Greenaway's one here. This is very straightforward, do the thing, review the thing, plan the thing, do the thing, review the thing, plan the thing. It's really stripped this down to its bare essentials, I think, but perhaps something that we can have some sympathy with. Critics have suggested that really Greenaway has collapsed the distinction between reflecting in and reflecting on, because there's no scope in this for stepping back and thinking about and the reflection upon values and assumptions that's, say, present here and also in Kolb here in the making of generalizations. And then, of course, we've got, this is Gibb here, his ideas. So he's got this idea of plan the action, describe what happened, how did it make you feel, Work out, are those feelings and ideas important? Analyze, so this is to reverse the norm that people would usually have. So once we've worked out whether or not the feelings that we had are important, we're then in a position to work out how those things relate to one another. Draw some conclusions, what could you have done? And then back into the action planning again. And so each of those different learning cycles that you can see there, largely drawing in inspiration on work by Sean and Argyris, who in turn inspired by Dewey, who in turn is inspired by the long-standing Western philosophical tradition of exploring our own thinking in order to think something different.